Hi, everyone. So, I wanted to share some bits of personal history today because it's really the personal side of history that I find interesting, and it's what drew me to study history. So, I'm going to share with you some little personal bits of history today as it relates to World War II. So, we all have histories of our own and our own family histories that brought us to where we are today. We all came from generations past, from people past. They actually lived through and contributed to the parts of history that we study today. You might have a relative that fought in the war, one who fought for your right to vote, or who sailed around the world to find a place to call home. Part of history is telling these personal stories. It's not just facts and politics, it's these personal connections. For me, it's these personal stories that make history come to life, and it's why I love studying history. So I'm going to share with you a part of my family's history as it connects to Canada's role in World War II. You are always welcome to share your own personal stories as well. So this is Leonard Saville. He is my grandmother's father, technically great-grandfather. He was born in October 26, 1908 in England, so he was from Great Britain, and he came to Canada in 1923. He enlisted in World War II, July 26, 1940. So this is what he looks like in his military uniform. So this is Leonard. So I'll tell you a little bit about Leonard before the war. So he was born in England in 1908, came to Canada and to Niagara in 1923. He actually worked as a chemist at the nickel plant in Port Colborne. So that's where he lived and spent a good amount of his life. He was a very musical guy. He came from a very musical family. He played the saxophone and trombone. And every weekend he played with his band in the park, and they had like an 8-piece band. So it was like jazz music of the 20s and 30s and all of that. And it's where he met his wife, Annie. So he was playing in the park on a weekend, and Annie was there with her friend to get ice cream, and they were playing, and that's where they happened to meet. Long story short, the two of them get married, and they end up having 3 daughters, and they live in Port Colborne. And if you want to check out, this is a bit of his enlistment record, and it goes over his family. So enlistment. So Leonard enlists in World War II. So on July 26, 1940, him and his entire band decide that it's his duty to enlist in the war. He wanted to fight for Great Britain, he wanted to fight for Canada, and they all agreed. Remember, the war started in 1939 in September. So this isn't too long after the war that they decide that they are all going to enlist together. He enlists with the Lincoln and Welland Regiment. So this is actually the local regiment. It's a very big regiment for Niagara. Originally, it wasn't a combat regiment, like it was just mainly about home defense. But as the war progresses, they do actually become an active combat regiment. And him and his band actually entered as bandsmen, so as members of the Lincoln and Welland Band. And they played in the band before going overseas. So they would entertain at different events. They would be the ones who were doing the calls in the morning. So they were there, and they were still doing all the military drills as that, but as a whole, they were the band. And he himself had the rank of private. So this is actually his Canadian Active Service Force paper. So like I said, the Lincoln and Welland Regiment wasn't active service right away. They were more about home defense, but very, very quickly as the war began, they became what was called an active service force. So you can see that you have his name here, you have his address, his date of birth, where he was born, religion, an important thing that they noted. His trade or calling, he was a chemist, he was married, his wife there, Annie or Anne, again, where they live, and then his service, so 2 years in the 98th Regiment Band, which was the Lincoln and Welland Regiment Band, and then other information about him. You can see his signature there, so Leonard H. Saville, Leonard Harold Saville. And yeah, so this is what it all looks like. And it says he actually enlisted at Camp Niagara, and you might remember that from World War I. That is in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and that's still where the regiment was based out of in World War II. And they spent a lot of time at Camp Niagara. That's where they trained for the beginning of it. So this is his active service file, and he was fingerprinted and photographed. So this is a picture of him and other members of the Lincoln and Welland Regiment getting on the train before they head out for further training. And I just think it's a great picture. This is one of those classic type of photos that you see from the war, of the soldiers hanging out of the train, waving goodbye to their friends and family, not necessarily knowing when they'll be back. But this is Leonard right here. So training, well, him and his regiment trained at Camp Niagara in the Niagara-on-the-Lake. Then they went out to Nanaimo, BC for a little bit. Then at the end of 1942 into 1943, they actually were stationed in St. John's, Newfoundland. So they went out east. So they went from west all the way to the east, and they were there for a significant period of time before in July 1943, they actually get shipped over to the UK. They're there for about a year, almost exactly a year, and then he lands in France. So he doesn't actually end up in France until towards the end of the war, and that's just because of the training and the process that it took to get certain men to the war. And he didn't have military experience before the war, so there was a lot of training that they had to go through. So again, we have a couple pictures of him here. I love this picture because it's him and just a random Newfoundland dog just there hanging out. Just a fun photo from 1943, probably when they were training in Newfoundland. So he has an interesting time in Newfoundland. So while training and stationed in Newfoundland, Leonard wanted his wife Annie to come visit him. So he was a little homesick. He wanted his wife to come say hi. She had actually taken a job at the nickel plant in Port Colborne. So he had left a job at the nickel plant, and like with the home front that we're going to study in a minute, a lot of men who went off to war, women came in and filled their places, and that's what Annie did. She took a job at the plant to essentially make ends meet for her daughters because, again, soldiers were getting paid, but it wasn't necessarily steady pay, so she needed to find a job. She was able to get some time off, and she found a friend to care for their daughters, and she made it all the way to Nova Scotia. But once she got to Nova Scotia, she was a little stuck. She couldn't get a plane to go to Newfoundland because of all the servicemen coming in to train to Newfoundland, because that was usually the last stop before being put on a ship to go overseas. So she was there in Nova Scotia, and she kept getting bumped from each flight. She'd get there, she'd check in for a flight, and then they'd say, "Sorry, ma'am, we have to fill your spot with another serviceman, so you have to wait till the next flight." So she kept getting delayed, and she was getting really frustrated. So she actually called Leonard and said, "Look, like, I can't get to you through plane. I have to take the ferry." And he did not want her to take the ferry at all. He was adamant that she could not take the ferry. And that was because there were known German U-boats and submarines and German ships in the area all along the eastern seaboard of Canada and the United States. There had actually been some involvement with German U-boats in attacking different areas within Canada and the United States. So Leonard was very nervous that his wife would get on a ferry and that ferry would be attacked. So he told her, "Do not do it, just wait." But of course, Annie was a bit stubborn, so she hopped on the next ferry and got there, and Leonard was not very happy, but it didn't really matter because he was just happy to see her. So while they were there, it was actually pretty funny because I think I'm missing this slide. That's okay. So while they were there, Annie got to the military base, but they weren't allowing women into the base at that time. It was just active servicemen, unless women were there for a specific job. They were part of the service if they were there for like an actual physical job. So because Leonard and his band were the band and they were playing on Saturday nights, they actually snuck his wife into the military base saying that she was their singer. for the night. That was not true. Annie could not sing. She was not a singer. But it was the way that they were able to sneak her in and get her to spend some time with Leonard. So I think that was just a kind of a cute story for them. So on another occasion, it's a little bit of a scarier situation. Leonard and other members of his regiment went into town to attend a barn dance at the Knights of Columbus Hall and hostel. So all over Newfoundland, there were different halls and events that were happening to entertain the servicemen. And while they were there, a fire broke out, and it was a very big fire, quick-moving fire, killed about 100 or so people, many of them servicemen. Leonard escaped the fire and got out, but everyone suspected that it was a German saboteur who set it. Because of the known activity of German U-boats in the area, there are said to be times where German soldiers actually came onto land. They were able to disguise themselves, and then they sabotaged different areas, especially around military bases. And I believe after this fire, there were a few others that happened as well, all found to be with accelerants. So even if it wasn't a German, it was someone who was clearly actively against the Canadian military at the time. So it was a little more of a scary moment, but I think it brings into the idea and the topic that like Germans actually did come onto Canadian soil, and there was this threat on the home front. So he moves off to Europe in July 1944. He actually lands in Normandy, France. First in 43, he goes to the UK. Then he gets to France a year later after doing training in the UK. Leonard at this point wasn't a bandsman anymore. They were split up into more active service roles. So he was a driver, and he was often driving water trucks. He also drove what were called Bren gun carriers. So he was actively driving different people around and driving different heavy machinery around. And that is a picture of him here leaning on one of his Bren gun carriers. So here we see a water purifying truck. So he would often drive those around. So if you were in an area where you could get water, but it wasn't necessarily clean water to drink, they would bring these trucks around so that they could have clean water for the men. And then this is what a Bren gun carrier looked like. It's almost like a mini tank. So the driver sits down in here, he steers everything around, and there's usually one, maybe two guns attached to the carrier itself. Plus they can store a few more things in there as well. So he was driving these trucks around. Water purifying trucks would definitely be a target because without clean water, soldiers could not survive. And then, of course, Bren gun carriers were active weapons. So Leonard, unfortunately, did not survive World War II. On October 4th, 1944, he was in the Netherlands, and Leonard was driving a truck, we believe a water purifying truck, when the Germans attacked their position, and a shell exploded right in front of his truck. And he was hit with shrapnel from the explosion, and he was listed as wounded. So he arrived at a hospital, and he was alive. He was just covered in shrapnel, but he ended up dying that same day. So on October 4th, 1944, Leonard Saville died. And this is a copy of his casualty notification. So this is an official copy, a copy for their document file. And you can see here his name, his number, his regiment, his birthday, all of his information here. And then we have his casualty details. So the date, October 4th, 1944, died of wounds. It says France. He actually did die in the Netherlands. So this is the information there. So since he did die in Belgium, in the Netherlands, he is buried in Belgium in the Adegem Canadian War Cemetery. So he was laid to rest there. And originally, this is what his headstone looked like. So during the war, because there were so many casualties, they were doing what they could to quickly bury bodies. Even after the war, they just made makeshift wooden grave markers. So they knew exactly who was there, where they were, what were their ranks were. And then later on, the Canadian government does develop actual headstones and like physical headstones, not necessarily just wood, to mark their places. So this is Leonard Saville's in Belgium. So it gives his information here: Private L.H. Saville from the Lincoln and Welland Regiment, died October 4th, 1944. He was only 36 years old. And at the bottom, the family usually gets to choose an inscription. So his parents chose the inscription. And it says, "To our sleeping son, as husband, father, soldier, your duty you fulfilled." So if we look back on the home front, Leonard got overseas, fought in France for several months, and then unfortunately was killed October 1944. Back at home, the family, they don't necessarily know what's going on minute by minute or day by day. They're waiting for news. So my grandma, who was about 12 at the time, her and her sisters were in school when they were called to the office, and their uncle was there, and he showed up to take them home. And my Nana says that she always remembers that as soon as they got into the car, their uncle said, "Don't talk, don't ask any questions, just wait until you get home." So she knew right away something was off. When they got home, their whole family was there. So their whole family was in their house. And again, she knew something was wrong because that never had happened. And she said her mother just pulled them all into this big hug, and it felt like they were all suffocating, that she wasn't going to be able to breathe. But it really just didn't matter because something horrible had happened, and she just wanted to be there for her mom. And my grandmother was the oldest of her the three girls, so her two younger sisters. So she wanted to very much stay strong for them. So she didn't move or say anything. She just waited. And then she said when they were released from this hug from their mom, she looked on the coffee table, and there were the two notices there. They had come on the same day because they had drafted the wounded notice, and then within hours he had passed. So they then drafted the second notice, and the wounded notice had already been sent. So she ended up with two notices on the same day. And this is a copy of the telegram that she received. So it says here from Ottawa, it says, "Mrs. Annie H. Saville, report delivery," then her address. 1680 Minister of National Defense deeply regrets to inform you that B41380 Private Leonard Harold Saville has now been officially reported died of wounds 4th of October 1944. Stop. If any further information becomes available, it will be forwarded to you as soon as received. Director of Records." So that is the letter and the telegrams that women received, wives received, daughters received, just to tell you that your significant other or your husband, your father, your brother had died. It's very official. It is not necessarily cold, it's just very factual, not a lot of support within the letter, and that's just what it was like. These are the facts, this is what we know, we'll let you know if anything else comes of it. So, unfortunately, he dies. Annie and her three daughters must go on. So Annie does remarry. My grandma says that she didn't remarry for love. She remarried for stability, because as a woman, would have been very difficult for her to hold a job full-time plus support three girls on her own. So she remarried for financial support, which was very, very common after the war. And then something interesting happened. So widows were able to get pensions on their husbands who had passed away in the war. So essentially, this was the government's way of saying, your husband died, here's some money that you can take for his death. However, many of them did not know that this was available until many years after the war. So for Annie, it wasn't until 50 years after the war that she read a newspaper article that told her and my grandma and others that she was actually eligible for a war widow's pension. So as soon as they found that out, they rushed and they applied, and she actually was able to receive about $10,000 for her husband's death. It was spread out over a period of time, but other war widows never received this pension because they just didn't know it existed. And by the time this information became more widespread, others had either passed away or moved on or didn't want to think about it anymore, so they weren't going to claim it. Another thing happened. So in 1964, a program was put in place for war widows and their children to go see the graves of their husbands and fathers. So this is something we don't always think about. When a soldier died over in Europe, their body was laid to rest there. They were not brought home, and travel is not like it is today. They could not just hop on a plane and go over very easily. It would have been very difficult, especially trying to find where they were and getting around in Europe at the time. Many widows and family members never saw their loved ones' graves from World War I or World War II. So the Canadian government in the 60s decided to try to make a program to allow people to go see where their husbands or fathers were laid to rest for the final time. My Annie, she actually had gone through breast cancer at this point, and she did not want to travel. So my grandmother actually traveled, and she traveled to Belgium and the Netherlands to see her father's grave, and they were assigned a host family. So part of this program was that they'd sign up, and then they'd get assigned a host family who would allow them to stay at their house, and they'd feed them and show them around. And my grandma actually still stays in contact with her host family today, and her host family takes care of the grave. They go to visit the grave for her. They'll send her updates on Remembrance Day, on the anniversary of his death. They will go and put flowers on his grave for him, for her. And she was very, very grateful for them. And the people of Belgium and the Netherlands were extremely grateful for these Canadian soldiers. And that's because in World War II, Canadians actually liberated those areas. So they had been under German rule. And then as the war went on, and at the end of the war, the Canadians came in and pushed the Germans out. So if you ever go to Belgium and the Netherlands, they are extremely grateful for Canadians, and they will tell you that. They'll stop you if you wear a Canadian pin. It's just a lot of pride and love for Canada there, which is pretty cool. So she went there, and she definitely felt that, and she was able to see her father's grave for the first time, and then she went back in 2012 to see him again. Then another interesting thing happened in all this story. So another side of war we don't necessarily think of, and a war that kids played, was in these telegrams that were delivered. So in the summer of 2015, my grandmother was actually playing golf, and they got put in this group, and she got put with a couple men who she didn't know, but one of them kind of looked familiar. And the one guy recognized her from elementary school, and he came up to her and right away said, "You are Audrey, I know you. You went to this school, and I will never forget you and your family." And she was very confused and like, "Oh, that's awesome that you remember me, but why? Like, why do you remember me? Why won't you forget my family?" And he told her a story that at that time during the war, he was just 12 years old. He was in her class. His older brother had actually been part of the mail delivery service and the telegram delivery service. And they were extremely short-handed at this point in the war in 1944. There had been so many casualties and telegrams home from soldiers about information and anything that they were so short-handed that they were asking kids to come help them out. And this boy, who was just 12 at the time, stepped in because his brother was doing it, and he started delivering these telegrams. And unfortunately, he was the one who delivered the telegram of her father's death. And at this time, the postal service and the telegram service had a policy that if you delivered one of those notices, you had to stay with the person who received the news until someone else arrived. So you had to offer to call someone or get someone and stay with them just to make sure that they were okay, and if anything happened, you could help them. But he was just a 12-year-old boy. He had never necessarily dealt with that before. So he had this whole weight put on him that he had to deliver this horrible news. And then he had to stay with her until the rest of the family arrived. And he said he just never forgot that. He never forgot sitting with her, her being quiet, her waiting for other members of the family, and just having to be the one to bring that news. So it's another part of the war that we don't tend to think of, but it impacted many, especially kids. So while Leonard did pass away, he was granted a number of medals. Before, when he was actively in the war, he was granted the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal. And then after he passed away, he was granted the 1939 to 45 Star, the France and German Star, the Defense Medal, the War Medal, and the CVSM clasp. So he did get a number of medals, and that just shows his pride, or the pride that Canada felt towards their soldiers, even if they had passed in the war. So my grandma is the one who has told me this story. It's something that she keeps with her. It deeply impacts her. She said she really didn't think about history or her family until after that had happened to her, until she lost her father. And she just says, look around and really enjoy the world around you. Ask questions about the world, ask about your family, because she never thought to ask about her father and her father's life until he was gone, and ask about history as a whole. And she says, learn your own history and be thankful for the people around you. So that is my personal family history with regards to World War II. Again, if you have any of your own personal stories, you're always welcome to share that. But that's my little story into World War II. And hopefully you find it interesting. Leonard is one of the reasons I love to study history. I think he is definitely an inspiration, someone who wanted to get up and fight, and they went and they did their service. And unfortunately, he passed away, but he was definitely a great man. So I hope you have a good day, guys. Bye.